All right.
Welcome, everybody. My name is Mina Jane, and I'm one of the programming librarians here at the Cary Library in Lexington, Massachusetts. I'm really thrilled about this program about Black Lives Matter through the lens of Kriston Jae Bethel's camera. We're going to be talking about lots of things, and I'll get to Kriston in just a minute. A couple of things before that, though, is I would like to thank the Cary Library Foundation, which supports all of our adult programming, and we wouldn't be able to do these kind of programs without the foundation. I would also like to thank our partner group, ABCL, the Association for Black Citizens of Lexington, who have partnered on this program to bring this to Lexington and to you. We do have captions enabled for this program, so if you need captions, scroll down to the bottom of your screen and you'll see a thing that says subtitles or a live transcript, and you can use that during the presentation if you'd like. If you have questions, you can put them in the chat. Mostly we'll be doing the questions after Kriston's presentation, but we'll also be taking questions during if it's like something that's happening in the moment. So, but the bulk of the questions we'll have afterwards. Please also put your tech questions and your comments in chat as well. So I wanted to say this is really thrilling for me because I think that seeing anything like a movement or anything like the Black Lives Matter thing through pictures really brings it to life. And so I was really thrilled when Kriston agreed to do this program. He's coming to us from Philadelphia, and he is a photojournalist, a documentarian. Is that a right word? I'm going to use it. It works. He's an activist. He's a teacher. He's a coach. And I just found out he's also a rock climber. So he's an absolute star in every way. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Kriston and we'll get going. Welcome, Kriston.
Hi, Mina, and thanks again so much for having me today. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about my work. And given that we're in a pandemic right now, it's, those opportunities are more limited to be able to do them, obviously, in person. And so I'm really grateful for the opportunity to be able to speak to your community and also everybody else that's watching from different places across the country as well. And just excited to share what I've seen. So just to kind of talk about a few things about, I guess with myself too. I'm an editorial documentary photographer, which means that I go out and I make pictures of things that tell stories. I go out and I help capture these stories. And if you're reading the news and you're online, or if you get a subscription, that's kind of, goes hand in hand with telling these stories. And so I take that visual aspect and help bring that in general to the public. And that's kind of how that kind of fits together for me as part of that puzzle. And so, as you said, I'm in the Philadelphia area. A lot of the images that we're going to see, that we're going to talk about today, are going to be from Philadelphia and the surrounding area, also some different areas as well. And just to kind of talk a little bit about what we're going to kind of try to achieve today, we're not going to resolve America's issues in one Zoom call, in one conversation. But what I would like to do is help show a little bit about what I've seen with the Black Lives Matter movement, as well as help expand on that a little bit more, because I think that there is, an idea about what it means when we see this on the news. And I think it's important for people to understand a little bit more deeply about how we've kind of gotten to this point, what's led us here, and what some of these issues are that have brought this movement to the forefront today. So let's get into it. And let's, like I said, I have not done a lot of these presentations virtually. So let's hope that everything works out. And I'm going to go ahead and get started here. All right, are you seeing the presentation now?
Yes.
Great. All right. Fantastic. Let's hope it stays that way. So let's kind of just start from the beginning about where this movement has kind of come from. In the past, 5 to 10 years, we've seen a number of high-profile deaths of particularly Black Americans in the country, frequently at the hands of the police. And also at times we've seen it from private citizens. And so That's really where this movement has sprung out of. And when we talk about this, that's kind of, I think, where a lot of people have their initial thoughts when they think about the Black Lives Matter movement. And I think that we also see some division on this because people want to often take sides with community policing, because these are also people who are members of their community. They're people that are ideally, we believe, that are here to serve and protect us. And a lot of those people, they are doing that, and they are here for that too. But really, what I think is that Black Lives Matter is more of an idea about adjusting a system. And to clarify again, that when Mina mentioned me as an activist, I use that word very lightly. I would not call myself a Black Lives Matter activist. I would call myself a journalism activist and an educator as well. But I still want to make sure that we understand that I'm not necessarily advocating for any particular course of action. I'm just trying to really provide everybody with some information and show you what I've seen. And again, as Mina said, if you have any questions as we go along, please drop them in the chat. Mina's going to be watching the chat. I don't love just hearing my voice the whole time. So if anybody has anything they'd like to ask me about a little bit more in depth or bring up, please do so. And so when we're talking about how the Black community is feeling right now, in a lot of ways, it's a sadness that has kind of really been there for a long time. This feeling of being unheard, of being pressed down for a long period of time. And we've seen, for certainly, growth in this country over the past few hundred years, but that does not mean that there isn't still work to do. And so tonight we'll start with actually seeing the protests, and then, as I said, we'll talk about some of these issues, and we'll see where some of this work lies, who's doing this kind of work, and kind of understanding some of the solutions that are behind it. And so when we, again, as I said, talking about this feeling of emotion that we experience in America right now, and we're at a time in the United States where I think we can all agree that there is a great deal of emotion throughout everybody in the way we are experiencing the politics of the time. And I think the number one thing we want to be able to do is understand one another a little bit better. And so going back, this is Pastor Kevin Johnson, who's a pastor in Philadelphia, and his family. He organized and helped brought people down to a march on Washington back in August. And in speaking with him and photographing him and his family, he has concerns being a Black man in America and having young children, especially a young teenage son who's college age. And these concerns kind of go to what some people might call the talk. I don't think that every Black family necessarily does it, but it's something that we do, which is the idea of how to handle police, how to handle your safety. And I don't know that that's an experience that happens across everybody in America, but this idea of your family and how you protect them when you see that there is this large system of persecution or violence, and how do you protect your family and how do you navigate through that? And so they went down to Washington to march because at the core, it's a lot about being able to protect your family and having that equal right in our country to be able to grow up, live, and thrive. And again, when we talk about ways of protecting ourselves, something that I do think about as a person of color, as a Black man myself, is how I appear and how I present myself to others. This is Sabir Peel, who I photographed about 5 years ago, I believe 5 or 6 years ago. And he's a brand consultant. He dresses very, very well all the time. And this was a story that was run in Mashable called Black Armor, and it discussed how Black men across the country dress in such a way as to deflect negative attention. There is this idea of the hoodie, right, which I think brought a large conversation after the Trayvon Martin shooting. And this idea of how simply how you dress and appear can make you, as a Black man, appear threatening and appear dangerous to others, and thereby making yourself a target. And so while Sabir doesn't necessarily dress exclusively just to deflect attention and protect himself, he does notice a difference. He shared a story about how he used to take the bus all the time, and he usually dresses like this. And the one day he wore sweats, he got a bit of a look from somebody from the driver, and it is really interesting, and I've experienced it myself as well. How the way that you appear to other people can drastically change their perceptions and ultimately how safe people feel with you. So let's talk a little bit about the protests themselves. We talked a little bit about how we've gotten to this point and some of the history a little bit, or rather I should say recent history. But what do these protests look like? We often see marches in city streets, and especially if you're watching over the summer, we saw a number of protests throughout the country, especially in big cities throughout the country. And this was actually a protest that was not exclusively a Black Lives Matter protest in Philadelphia, but this was a rally after Charlottesville, and a number of cities had their own marches and protests in support, I guess not really a protest, but supporting Charlottesville and the violence that had occurred there. And so I think typically when we think about what a protest looks like, this is what we typically imagine. We imagine large groups of people walking down city streets and chanting, and but there are also many smaller protests, and this is what I started to see a little bit just in my own area. I live about 15 miles outside of Philadelphia in a suburban neighborhood in King of Prussia, and there was a Black Lives Matter march that was occurring in neighboring town of Bridgeport, and it's interesting because I saw a number of these protests popping up in smaller scale. And I say smaller scale, but these are still, sometimes hundreds of people, sometimes dozens of people. It might only be 10 people out on a street corner holding signs. And so when we try to understand what this looks like visually, it's more than just those large marches, those large gatherings. We see much smaller movement happening as well. And I think what that really shows us is it really speaks to how widespread this has come as a movement, in that we're seeing so many people partaking. And one thing I'll note as well, particularly I think in this area, is the diversity of people that are participating. It is not just Black people, but you're also having Hispanic people and white people and Asian Americans and all backgrounds joining in. And I noticed this, and I thought this was very interesting because, frankly, where I live, the Black population is much smaller than if you're actually in the city itself. And all these people joining in to help lend their voices, I thought really stood out to me. And another interesting thing too is that we've seen this narrative frequently, that it is people against the police, and it really is, I think what it is more trying to get at is the people versus a system. And so you do have officers like here these are from two different police departments, from Bridgeport Police Department and the Norristown Police Department. And oftentimes, if you've never been to a protest or a rally, police will arrive and they will block off streets and they will ensure that things are safe and protected. But the officers here wanted to really actually be a part of this march as well. And so they weren't just on the periphery, they were very active in engaging and speaking with people and making sure that people knew that they were supportive of what they were doing there. And this is a photo that I really love. This is Amari Jackson, who's 7 years old. I actually went over to Amari's house just a couple weeks ago. I met him at this protest, and I spoke with his mom, and I reached out to her to talk to him a little bit more recently. And we're going to do a little bit more work again together in the future. But another thing that I've been noticing too is that this is really a protest and a movement that is really driven by young people, and that's who we're really seeing out here. And I'm talking, kids that are 16, 17, 18, 19 that are out there that are really lifting up their voices and helping to elevate other voices as well.
Hey, Kriston.
Yes.
We had a comment from Jay who says, we had a handful of teens show up in town center almost every day this summer, small but persistent, which kind of goes right into what you're saying about the smaller protests and also younger people.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, the word that you're using there, persistent, right, is something that I think is what's really, different about what we're seeing right now. I think that, one is the scale, right? National protests happening on a large scale. Previously, we've been seeing protests happening perhaps more on the city level, but now it has really become much, and I say national level, I should really say international level, because we're seeing this occur in Europe and in Africa and in different places around the world that are trying to enact change to improve people. And yeah, absolutely. So I'm not at all surprised that you're seeing people showing up and standing out there. I was driving through another town just a couple of weeks ago, and it was probably around 7 o'clock in the evening, and I saw maybe about a dozen people, similar to what you described, standing out on a street corner. And again, all ages, seniors mixed in there, some younger people, just holding up signs. And so it's interesting how we're seeing this movement take shape. And even though really we saw a peak over the summer, it really has not dissipated, I wouldn't say, in a way that perhaps we've seen in the past. This is another march that occurred in another smaller town in New Jersey. It was organized by another young man in his early 20s, John Walls. And I went out to meet with him and photograph him. And he grew up in kind of a suburban community. And actually, I think he actually spent a lot of time in Atlanta before going to college. And his experiences with race, with being made to feel uncomfortable. And that's a big issue as well, is that the idea that people should feel comfortable with themselves wherever they are, and not be made to feel otherwise. And so he has done a lot of work in trying to organize protests and marches in smaller neighborhoods. And again, when we see marches, I think just occurring in big cities, we don't all live in those big cities. We live in rural communities, we live in suburban communities, we live all over the place. And so I do think it does a disservice when we just see these large marches happening, because it disconnects us from the reality and the idea that there can be problems within our own communities where we live, and it makes it more difficult to enact broader change. And another, this has been interesting too, in the way that this movement has been, and these what these protests look like. has been very interesting. In Philadelphia, there was a protest that had been occurring for weekly over the summer. It was a clarion call to justice. And they had a group of brass players showing up on the steps of the Philadelphia Museum of Art, which, if anybody has seen any of the Rocky films, I'm sure there are a handful of things that people know Philadelphia for. It's going to be the Rocky Steps, and probably cheesesteaks are probably two of the things at the top of the list. And but this protest occurring at the art museum, and so the manner in which we see protests too is more diverse than I think people realize, and it's not always about anger. It's about trying to, I think, bring hope to people as well. And this young man here, Brandon Combs, I got a chance to talk to him for a few minutes at one of these events they were having. And Brandon is actually Sergeant Brandon Combs with the Philadelphia Police Explorer Cadets. And Brandon is actually in this cadet program with the Philadelphia Police Department, which is designed to engage young people who are interested in law enforcement careers. So to help expose them to those careers and to help encourage them. And one thing that I think, the Philadelphia Police Department and one thing that's being called for is more people from the community to be taking on these roles. And I think when you bring on people from the community who understand the community, who understand and come from the same neighborhoods, it drastically changes that dynamic that you have. And talking to Brandon, it was really great. He talked a lot about how he just wants to be an officer in his community. He actually told me that one day he wants to be the police commissioner. And so that's a number of years down the road, but he doesn't want to just take it as a job, but he wants to actually enact change himself. And he wants to be part of that solution and helping bridging that gap between his community and law enforcement. This is Barbara Dowdle, and she is a member of the Unitarian Society of Germantown, which is a church in Germantown, which is a neighborhood in Philadelphia. And Barbara was really great to talk to as well. I met her on a story I was working on with the Philadelphia Inquirer. And so when we saw this growth in the Black Lives Matter movement, she took it upon herself to really not just try to listen, but also think about what that she could do to help better understand and better educate. So she actually started an ending racism committee at her church. I should back up a little bit too and mention that Barbara actually attended the March on Washington decades ago. And so she has a history of activism through the church and with her father, and founded this committee within the church to sit and have conversation, have discussion. And you have different viewpoints, you have different perspectives. The idea is not for everyone to sit down and just feel comfortable with the conversation and everybody agree, but it's to talk and better understand what's going on. And so they do readings and they have conversation, much like you might see at a Bible study with your church. And the idea of talking through things is really, to me, a really key element about where I think we need to go more broadly as a country. Because if we're not able to talk through these things or have these difficult conversations, we end up easily taking sides, reaffirming our own beliefs without challenging them. And it's hard work to do, and it's difficult to do so, but I do think that everybody benefits from it. So let's talk a little bit about, are there any questions, by the way? I'll pause for a second, Mina, if anything's come through.
We don't have any questions, but Leslie Irwin on Facebook said, it's great to see you and more of your work. Your photos are so powerful.
Thank you, Leslie. I appreciate that. And that gave me just enough time to take another sip of water. So when we talk about different issues, or at least when I'm talking about different issues with the Black Lives Matter movement, I do think that there is a difficulty in understanding where it's coming from, and more broadly, what is actually happening in America for the Black community, and how that experience is different. And so let's just kind of go through a few different examples about different issues that are faced by the Black community. And then we're also going to go beyond that just a little bit and talk about some solutions as well. And I shouldn't mention solutions without also mentioning solutions journalism. I do a lot of reporting with solutions journalism, and there's actually an organization called the Solutions Journalism Network, which is a national, international organization which promotes this style of journalism, which is really just to say that going beyond just what a problem is, journalism is always there, it exists to help highlight issues and help bring those issues to light, which is an incredible service that we as journalists provide to our communities, both locally and nationally. But when talking about solutions journalism, we want to go just a little bit deeper to look at how those problems are being solved. And it's not a matter of just puff pieces or feature stories that are just looking at making people feel good, although at times they might, but it really is looking more in depth at what is working, what isn't working, why isn't it working, and just seeing what people are trying to do to help fix these issues. And in Philadelphia as well, there is an organization called Resolve Philly, which is a collaborative project organization between a number of Philadelphia newsrooms. It's somewhere between 20 and 30 newsrooms, I believe, and working to help produce solutions content. And so it's really interesting that this happens because we have newsrooms working together instead of competing against one another, which is how I imagine a number of people might imagine newsrooms working. But coming together to help really improve the service that we're providing to our community in Philadelphia. So let's look at a few different stories and a few different individuals related to this issue. So this is Josh Glenn. He founded the Youth Art and Self-Empowerment Project in Philadelphia, and he is also a former incarcerated citizen. And when he was younger, and I won't go into too many details about, why, but when he was younger, a teenager, he was arrested on a drug charge and had been very much pushed, in a situation where he did not have perhaps the same counsel that might be afforded to somebody else. And so he ended up serving time that was perhaps a bit longer than would have been expected. But what he did with that experience was to turn that around and to help young people, both in and out of prison, to help them out and improve their lives. And so he's really taken this opportunity to assist with helping break this cycle for young people. Because one of the things, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in a second, once you have a conviction, it makes it difficult to find employment. That can really stigmatize you and follow you around for the rest of your life. To say nothing of the fact that at 16 years old, he was taken out of the education system and placed into the prison system. So he's missed out on an opportunity for education and missed out on an opportunity perhaps to improve himself. And Josh himself, willfully admits that, he's made these mistakes. But when we talk about criminal justice and criminal justice reform, the idea is, how do we keep people from being trapped with these mistakes, and how do we help them to actually improve their lives and return back to their communities and be productive? Another really great example is Aaron Kirkland, who again was arrested as a juvenile and had been very much pushed to take a deal. And he ended up not taking the deal, but he was told that if you don't take this deal, you're going to end up staying in prison a lot longer. You're going to go to jail for life. And it ended up, what happened was he ended up not taking the deal, but friends of his who did take that deal ended up uh, serving a longer sentence. And so one of the things that I think is important to understand is that at 16 years old, I I get nervous when we talk about 16-year-olds driving on the road, and so that level of responsibility that they have, and it's not a matter of ignoring the mistakes that are made, but how do we create a system that equally rehabilitates rather than exclusively punishes. But beyond that as well, there was a program created called PowerCore PHL. And what this did is it allowed returning citizens, as I mentioned before, who might otherwise find difficulty in finding employment. If you can't find employment, you might not be able to pay rent or be able to keep up with your parole officer. And then it ends up leading into a cycle where you end up back down in the crime just to be able to survive. And then you end up back in prison. So with this program, and there are several programs similar to it, it helps place returning citizens within jobs. And so Aaron was in this PowerCore PHL program, which allowed him to do work with the Philadelphia Water Department. And so it might be what might seem to some people as simple, right? Making sure that certain areas are being maintained and cleaning. He's actually doing maintenance here for a drainage system. And so actually, if you see that tree on the right-hand side, it's connected to a drainage system, which, if you know anything about urban environments, is a huge issue since we paved huge areas. And so he's able to be employed, which helps, ultimately keep him out of trouble, provide for himself, and prevent him from going back down an otherwise more difficult path that might lead him back into prison. This is Helen Levin with the Philadelphia Public Defender's Office, and she works with the Juvenile Lifers Project. And one change that we've seen in Pennsylvania is a change in the law that prevents juveniles from being convicted of life sentences. And so previously it was possible that if you were 16 years old, you could be charged with a crime associated with federal crime, or with such accessory to murder or a crime along those lines. And for some of these stories, it's very difficult because we all, I think in generally, we want to feel safe. And so when we hear stories about crime, especially about violent crime, we want to know and understand that the law exists to protect us and discourage it, and to ensure that people who do commit these crimes are punished. But then you end up with people who are perhaps more on the periphery, who might be associated with somebody or associated with an incident that happened, and perhaps we're not intending for it to happen, but end up getting swept up in something. And they've been charged at 16 years old. And at 16 years old, there's no chance for rehabilitation if you've been given a life sentence. And so that law was changed in Pennsylvania, but that still leaves a number of people who are still in the system who have previously been charged and given a life sentence. And so Helen with the Public Defender's Office works to help get these former juveniles released. And these are people who are no longer, we're not talking necessarily about 16, 17-year-olds. We're talking about people who have served for 10, 20, 30 years of a life sentence since they were teenagers. And I believe there's somewhere between 200 and 300 in Pennsylvania. And Philip Pratt was one of those people. And again, in talking about providing opportunity and growth for people to change their course, Philip, I was here to photograph Helen, and Philip happened to be there on this day. Philip was actually in the system. He had been convicted as a teenager and had been sentenced to life in prison. And Helen, with the Public Defender's Office, worked to get him released. And it's not an easy thing to do, going through case files, proving the age at the time. especially when you're going back to cases that are dating, 20, 30 years ago. But I got to meet and talk to Philip, and he's actually working with the public defender's office now with this program, or at least at the time he was. And he's also a really great writer as well. He got involved with writing in prison and carried that over once he left as well. And so again, when we talk about criminal justice reform, I believe the idea is that we're looking at the idea of how do we help people improve their lives after they have served their time, after really looking at when does a punishment actually end and when does your opportunity for a new life begin.
So Kriston, we have
Yes.
a question from Sarah, who says,
Yes.
all of these stories are so important to tell, but do you have a sense of which stories hit home the most for viewers in terms of the photography? Do you feel people resonate with some of these stories like the church group or the issues with the criminal justice system as much as they do with protest images?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really interesting question because a lot of times as a journalist, or at least as a photojournalist, we don't always interact with the end user, right? Which is the news consumer. So we don't always know, I think, what's best resonating with people. But that said, news organizations, they have people who measure these metrics. And one thing that I thought was very interesting, and again, talking about solutions journalism, I was at a small meeting several years ago, and one of the speakers was the editor for the Seattle Times, and he was talking about how they had started doing solutions journalism. And one thing that they found was that solutions journalism really, really resonated with people. We have a tendency to hear a lot about when we talk about the news, about how people are tuning out the news because it's too negative. They don't want to see it anymore. To say nothing about the struggles with trust in the news today as well. But what they found with their publication is that as with their solution stories, people really loved it. They were more engaged. They found it very positive. And you're still providing people with news and information. It's not so drastic, I don't think, that it's unrecognizable, but it does kind of take the formula a little bit and just turn it such that it provides a different perspective for people to engage with. Hopefully that answers the question a little bit.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So we're going to look at another story here, another solution story. So this is the Community Crisis Intervention Program in Philadelphia, and there are similar programs in other cities around the country. And this is a group, it's organized under the city, but with volunteers. And they go out and they engage with communities around the city, specifically targeting areas that might be high in crime or have had recent crime or violence. And so this is them. The first thing they do, they go literally out in the middle of the night. They start at maybe like 7 or 8 o'clock, and they'll go to 11, 12, 1 o'clock in the morning to be seen, and also kind of engaging with people as well. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But one of the first things they do is they go in, first they determine what areas they're going to visit, and then they'll stop in at the police station, and they will speak and kind of check in with them, make sure that people know that they know that they're going to be walking around, because as we discussed before, a bunch of Black men walking around in the middle of the night can set some people, make them feel uneasy a bit. And so they'll check in with the officers there to make sure, that they know that they're going to be walking around, so if they get any calls, they have an understanding about what's happening, but also to see if there had been any reports of violence during the day, that particular day. But then they'll go check out specific areas. So in this, walking over to a playground, field and playground area where there's known, where they said there was known drug activity which had taken place. And so they actually go into these areas to engage with people, and not that they're going to go in and physically interrupt any type of violence, but to help engage with people, and making sure that they are aware of what resources are available to them. And so they'll go to corner stores, they'll engage with businesses as well to make sure that they know that they're out there and that they can be reached out to. This was really interesting. So we had been walking around, well, not just walking around, we've been driving around and walking around these neighborhoods for a couple hours. And the young man on the right, they just kind of stopped and asked him, like, hey, what are you doing out here? Because they'll just do this. They'll straight up walk up to somebody and say, hey, what are you doing out here tonight? What's going on? Checking in with them. And he had just been finishing up shopping at a store, just picking up some small things. And, they talked to him about, have you been involved or seen anybody or engaged with it? If you have any experience with, particularly asking about gun violence, which is a very large issue with the city. And so he had said, not necessarily asking if they're going out and committing crimes, right? But asking if they have any sort of personal connection with the number of shootings that do take place. There are a lot of people who have had a connection, whether they, have a family member themselves or a friend. And he had said that not too long ago, it had only been, I believe, in the past year or two, that he himself had been shot by a friend. He'd been shot 6 times in the leg and had survived. But that had really shaped his perspective on things. He had a young daughter who I believe was 2 at the time. And as a young father, he wants to be there for his child. But the really funny thing was that while we're there having this conversation, he gets a phone call, says, hang on a second. Oh, it's his mom. And his mom's calling him and is already asking him, hey, you're not back, checking in on him, make sure that he's okay. And so one of the members says, here, let me talk to her. And so he talks to her for a few minutes, speaks to her, makes sure they're yeah, he's safe, everything's okay. I'll tell you what, we're going to make sure he gets home. And so they actually go ahead and give him a ride home, which I thought was a really great moment in not just talking with somebody, but also trying to show some action as well. So these 3 women are really great. This is there's a program, a lactation program at Riverside Correctional Facility in Philadelphia, and there's very few of these kinds of programs around the country. I think there might have only been 1 or maybe 2 others in the U.S. at the time we were doing this. But what it did is it allowed mothers with young children the opportunity to breast pump in prison. So the prison the organization had a room set aside for them with several breast pumps, and allowed these women to come in, pump breast milk, which then the Mom Mobile program would then freeze and then deliver to their children. And it was a great way of being able to connect these mothers with their children. And so again, when we talk about what reform looks like, right, we ask ourselves, I think, or at least I think we should be asking ourselves, how can the criminal justice system do better? What can be done to make it something that helps rehabilitate people and provide opportunity for people to prevent them from coming down a path? And beyond that, it really does help these women stay connected with their children so that they're not missing out on these really literally formative years of their lives. Okay, so yes, go ahead.
So Kriston, before you move on to the next section,
Yeah.
Grace has this to say. I think these photos and the stories behind them erase the lines behind the arrogance. It's a different level of communication to people who feel threatened by the movement. And those last pictures, I think, speak so highly of that, so well to that.
Yeah, and I think that's my role as a journalist, I think, is to I think the role of journalism is one of education, and to help provide information to people. And so I think with this movement, what I've seen, and again, these might not necessarily be considered, Black Lives Matter photos. When I set out from these stories, it wasn't with necessarily all that intent, but creating a better understanding about where this movement has come from, and what's kind of at stake, and what's being the kind of questions that we're asking and they're being asked. I think the goal is to help communicate something a little bit differently than perhaps what we're seeing.
Mm-hmm.
And so I knew that I was going to spend a good deal of time on criminal justice. We're going to talk a little bit about, I didn't quite know what to call this, equity or building communities. It kind of takes place with all this, but we're going to talk a little bit about equity within the Black community, and what that looks like.
Before you move on to that, Kriston,
Yes.
can I just, there's one question and one comment. Edward wrote, knowing, seeing what's at stake is so important. And Sarah had asked in that last section, when talking about juvenile lifers, how disproportionately are those numbers between Black versus white?
I do not have specific numbers on juvenile lifers. I can tell you that, it will most likely track with the broader prison population, in that the prison population is disproportionately Black, and that is oftentimes attributed to an over policing. So yes, there is crime that occurs in Black communities, and is something that has been debated and discussed for years and years and years. But I think the idea of how do we adjust this and help improve those numbers, it's not a matter of asking, should we let violent criminals go, or should we not feel safe in our neighborhoods, or letting crime go by, but it's a matter of trying to rebalance what this looks like. And so while I can't directly answer that question, I would not be surprised if the numbers are higher for Black juveniles versus white.
And would you mind if somebody, Grace unmuted and asked you a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, go ahead, Grace.
So I really wanted to bring up a point that the Black Lives Matter movement is majority about police brutality, and how we can change that, because there's so much wrong with it that it's plainly there. Like, we saw it with the Capitol, and we saw it with these protests. And what I was like, an observation that I had is that after hearing all of these stories and how these communities try to help each other, it's like, it's so much more than just the police, because America is built on the backs of Black people. They did all of the work, and like, we're reaping the benefits now. But like, it's rooted in the school systems. They're at an automatic disadvantage by like this over policing, getting incarcerated at young ages, and I think it's going to take so much more than just it's going to take so much more than just fixing the police force to help Black individuals now. Do you feel me, or am I just rambling?
No, absolutely, Grace. And I think, again, none of this is a takeaway from really the idea of the core foundation of how Black Lives Matter started, which is, as you said, rooted in police brutality, right? And I think, as you said, these are issues that help feed into that system, that help allow it to occur. And honestly, I really haven't talked too much about the whole concept of systemic racism as a whole, right? I'm talking a lot about issues,
Yeah.
but that's, you know, and the reason for that is because it's, for me, it's easy to show. It's easier to show what's happening than to try, I think, for me at least, to explain the history of racism in America. But I do think you're right in that if we are looking to end violence, you know, if the idea is to improve people's lives really, and we have to understand more broadly, I think, about all the facets of what's happening in our country and in our communities. And I really think, I keep saying community, but I think it's really important to understand at a deep community level, um, at our own individual communities, what's going on. And because, as I mentioned earlier, it's not a matter of what's happening 100 or 500 miles away. Um, there are things happening right around us. And you know, you did say that it's plain to see, and I would counter that. I think some people do struggle to see it. They struggle to relate. They struggle to understand it because they don't always live that experience, and they don't always see the same things. And I don't inherently fault people for that. But as a journalist, for my part, it's for me to help bring awareness to that.
Yeah, and I agree with you. I think awareness is so important because it's so easy to stay in what you grew up in. You know, I grew up in South Philly, so if you wanted to, you could stay in South Philly your entire life if you really wanted to. Um, but yeah, I think it's so important to have this awareness and to have these kinds of events to, you know, just show people that there's more than your bubble.
Thank
Yeah,
you, Grace.
absolutely.
Thank you, Grace. So let's move on to community building.
Yeah, absolutely. So I went down to Baltimore about, this was not at the start of the pandemic, but this was maybe around uh, April or May, and for the Christian Science Monitor, and going down there to take a look at how the pandemic is affecting the Black community, right? And if you're following any of the numbers, we've seen in a number of ways that Black Americans are taking a disproportionate, um, you know, or the community has taken a disproportionate toll throughout the pandemic in terms of deaths. And there are a number of reasons for that. Access to healthcare, access to hospitals, access to PPE and resources, as well as the fact that a number of people are working in what we've classified now as essential service jobs, which might have just been previously called service jobs, right? And as well as a number of Black-owned businesses that have been closed or have you know, been lost as a result of the pandemic. So this gentleman here, this is Thomas Banks. I talked to him for a little bit. He's actually working with somebody else doing some car cleaning just out on the street, and so they're doing cleaning and detailing. And you know, he had been laid off um, from a construction job, and then got another job working at a Filo warehouse, which is down in Baltimore, and then had been there for a few months, and then ended up being laid off from there as well. And you know, he wants to work, he wants to have a job, but you know, he's out here instead, um, you know, cleaning cars, which is not what he wants to do. You know, he was telling me how he went to school, as he said, to be a water operator. And now, as we talked earlier about how it can be difficult to, when you're at an economic disadvantage, how difficult it can be to avoid, as he said, do something really stupid. He said, I'm trying really hard not to, he's trying not to do something stupid. But it can be difficult when you feel as though you're presented with no options. And what might seem an easier option is presented in front of you. And so another thing too is just being able to find housing. And this is, I believe this is Dion. I can't remember. I'm gonna forget his name. But he had also been laid off from work and then was not able to pay rent. And so he couldn't live in an apartment. And so he's now living with his wife and kids in a hotel. And so we're seeing the effects of even this international pandemic, how it can affect people differently. But then what is the solutions aspect of that, and what's being done really about it, right? So this is at another community center, in Baltimore, and where they actually have nursing classes to help people who are preparing to be nurses, who want to take a test, to practice those basic skills and to learn. In addition to that, they're also helping to provide hot meals. They're also providing, jumping ahead to that, fresh fruit and vegetables to people as well. And so a true community center that's really providing for its community and finding what its needs are in different ways. I really love this portrait of Farmer Chippy. He's really great. Again, we're still in Baltimore, and if you've ever driven through any kind of urban neighborhood, one kind of recurring theme that we probably hear about or see is this idea of urban decay, right? Buildings collapsing or in various states of disrepair, of empty lots. In Philadelphia, where we have a number of row homes, you'll see just like empty lots where there used to be a home and it just feels like an empty space. Well, Farmer Chippy took some of these lots and decided to make something out of it. And what he made out of that was a farm. And it's more expansive than this, but it's probably about the size of maybe 3 or 4 row homes, maybe a little bit larger. It's a good plot of land. And set up a tunnel and has different vegetables growing. And he was such a great guy to talk to. He had such a bright personality, very engaging. But he again felt that he wanted to take things into his own hands and make something and literally grow something. And again, helping to provide for his community in a way that is also, putting into an economic system as well.
Sarah wants to know, did he pose for that photo because it's such a great moment?
So it's a great reaction, right? We had set up to do this photo. We're about to do a portrait, and it's just a matter of when you're doing portraits and trying to bring something out of people, we're just having a conversation. We're having a great conversation, and it could have been very somber, but he's actually just saying, like, look at all of this. And he just turns and gestures. So no, I didn't pose him like that. I didn't direct him. It's just we're photographing and I'm ready to photograph him and ready to go. And he just does this, and I got the photo as he's doing this. And it is just really, really, really great guy. This is Dr. Ayla Sanford, who is a pediatric surgeon and also the founder of the Black Doctors COVID-19 Consortium. And you might have seen her in a number of places. She's done a number of interviews, including on CNN. And at the outset of the pandemic, one thing that she noticed is that there was a difficulty in reaching Black communities. And so rather than waiting, she actually took her own money and started paying for resources herself and figured like, you know what, the money will come later, we'll figure it out later, and started doing this outreach work. And so she actually, her organization goes and started providing testing. And this is at a time where we're realizing that we really need to have a lot of testing going on if we're going to be able to understand where the virus was and how it was reaching the community. But again, trying to reach out to the Black community and then better engage with them. And so when we think about what equity and equality looks like, we shouldn't limit ourselves to just what's the obvious, right? Which might be employment or it might be income, right? There are a number of areas that this touches on, which includes healthcare.
Can Kim unmute for a second to ask a question?
Yeah, go right ahead.
Kim, go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I
Yep.
can.
Hi, Kriston. It's been a long time.
Hey, how are you?
Good. I'm good. Listen, I just want to make a comment. I'm an advanced practice nurse in the Philadelphia area, and when COVID first hit, I want to say around May, June, as the summer months started to progress, the media started making these claims that a lot of African Americans, in particular in the city of Philadelphia, weren't taking COVID seriously. We weren't wearing masks. We were having all these parties. And I just like to say, I actually thought that was very untrue and an unfair attack on our community, because I do a lot of community nursing in people's homes and in the, out in the public. I'm not based in a facility or a doctor's office. So when I would go out into the community, into the poor areas, people were masked, people had gloves on. We were taking this seriously. So in the beginning, it was very unfair. I thought that we were being labeled, even the Latin community we were told that we weren't taking things seriously, and that just wasn't true. So when they're saying things like this, and now that we have this vaccine coming out, I think they have to realize when you're saying things of that nature, like a certain group of people aren't taking things seriously, and that's not true, how do they expect then for everybody just to hop on the vaccine bandwagon? So I just wanted to say that. I just think in the beginning, things were just so all over the place, and we were being unfairly labeled as not taking things seriously. And that's just not what I saw. I'm sorry if that sounds like I'm rambling.
No, not at all, Kim. Thank you for sharing. And
Sure.
Yeah, at the outset, there was a lot of misinformation that was going on as well. There were rumors that Black people could not get COVID, that it was literally a whites only disease that was being spread around. And that's, obviously not true at all. So we live, not addressing directly, traditional media, but more broadly, we live in an age where information spreads so quickly and so easily that it can be incredibly difficult to find out what is true or what is incorrect or what is misleading or what is outright false. That's, one of the benefits of technology and the internet is that we can all share ideas very quickly. But it can make it very difficult for people when there's so much noise going on. To address specifically what you're saying about hearing the media as well, the media is there to help inform people and engage and help make good decisions, but it's not without its flaws, right? I do think traditionally media professionals try to do their best, but one thing I'll say about this is that I think we're trying to see a growth in the media to diversify ourselves and to have more people, because when you have, and I mean that in the broadest sense as well, people from different backgrounds, whether that's rural or suburban or urban, different education levels, different ethnicities, different in all different types of directions. But when you have that and you have a greater number of people working in the industry that have a better understanding of communities that we're reporting on and talking about, and that are, more importantly as well, which I think we've seen a loss of, is actually getting out into communities to actually see what's happening. when we're missing that, it leads to things like not understanding what's happening in Black and Brown communities, and when we do diversify, we do see a benefit from that, in that we do have a broader pool to draw upon to have a better understanding. I don't know if that addresses your statement at all, but hopefully that provides something.
It did. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. So we've got about like 5 to 10 more minutes. So we'll go through. I believe we're coming up on the last section. Real quickly, I'll mention Eric Marsh, who is, because it segues into what we're going to talk about as well. A resident of a neighborhood, or former resident of a neighborhood in Nicetown in North Philadelphia, and had fought very much against the construction of this gas plant in their neighborhood. And the plant, it's not a production plant, but it is designed by SEPTA, which is our Southeastern Pennsylvania Transportation Authority, to help power the railways, the regional railway. And there was a great concern about what this would do to their community by having this plant there in terms of pollution. Now, this is a community that already has, I believe, the highest rates of asthma in the city. And in fact, both of Eric's children have asthma. And so when we also think about equity, we need to think, environmental equality is something that's been increasingly talked about in the past few years. Obviously, I think climate change is the big international issue that's being addressed, but then you have a number of issues that come off of that as well, including what communities end up with potentially hazardous products coming into their neighborhoods, and they just felt that they were not being heard, and they felt that this was a potential issue that would exacerbate health issues in the neighborhood, which we'll talk about a little bit more under here. So I'm going to keep talking about urban development, and I'm going to really, really kind of go through some quick history. So Nicetown, Tioga, that's the area up in North Philadelphia where US Route 1 runs through, which was constructed about, I believe, in the 60s or 70s. I'm going to get the decade wrong. But it really cut through this predominantly Black neighborhood. So we see this 6-lane highway peeking through on the right-hand side. And you can imagine what this might do, if you have large amounts of volumes of traffic going through the middle of your neighborhood, and what that might do for health concerns as well. But on top of that, it also really cut through the heart of their business district as well. And it was created to help serve transportation getting from the suburbs down to the center of the city. But it ends up cutting right through these neighborhoods. And then the focus for this story was on this bridge where it's interesting that it's almost kind of a community gathering space here. But what they had wanted to do, and they've been trying to do for the past 10 years, is put in like a sport court and new playground to use this space to provide great opportunity for young people in their neighborhood. And this is Majida, who runs the CEO of the Nicetown CDC, which has been trying to get this project off the ground for at least 10 years now. And the struggle is in finding funding for that. It was a $10 million project, which sounds like a lot of money, but when you compare that to other projects in the city, which we'll kind of look at briefly, it's very small in comparison to certain projects that are $20 million, $50 million, $100 million. I did want to point out, so I have to say, when you're a male photographer walking around photographing children, you do have to be like kind of a little bit self-aware about what you're doing, right? And so I talked to a couple of these mothers who were there, explained the project that I was working on, photographing the children. And I'll have to say, the one thing that I did notice is that while I'm there, they're running around, they're playing, having a good time. and they're yelling, "Run, run! The cops are coming!" And it really stood out to me. And because you have this idea of cops and robbers, but really they're just playing it running from the police. And so I talked to their mothers, and I asked them, where does this kind of come from for them? And they said for their part, they talk to their children. They want them to trust the police so that if something happens, like I think most parents do with, police or firefighters, you want them to understand that these are people that are there to help you. But still, their classmates have different experiences, and so they get it even at the age of 5 or 6. This perhaps at an innate level, this distrust for law enforcement, but still trying to provide opportunity for the community. So this is a community festival that happens once a year, and they had like boxing set up, and so this is a youth boxing tournament, and adult boxing as well. And just trying to do the best with what they have and what they've been given. And again, trying to draw awareness to violence in the city and speaking out against that, and it all kind of has come together without no issue, I don't think, is ignored within these communities. So as Kim kind of mentioned, beyond the idea of just the Black community not taking COVID seriously, I do think there is at times this narrative that the Black community does not take care of itself, and I think that's factually inaccurate. That there are plenty of people out there doing the work and trying to help improve their communities. And we're getting a little low on time, so I won't dig into. This is I-95, which, in contrast to the bridge, which was built over and through Nicetown, 95, which I'm sure if you're on the East Coast, you know of it, was sunken down next to the adjoining neighborhood to help maintain their sight line of the river. You can't see it here. You can maybe see the bridge off to the right-hand side, but there's a river view there. And in fact, they're actually going to cap a section of 95 and place a park over it. And so we can see how over the course of decades, how community development can affect neighborhoods and affect the people that live there by these choices that we make decades ago. And I'll end on this last photo. I just wanted to kind of bring this back around together. These are, I had mentioned previously, the Police Cadet Explorers program. I had photographed that photo of him more recently, but also I'd actually met him. He's not in this photo, but I actually met him pre-pandemic at this event over the summertime. And just the idea of that police and the Black community, that there's not a way for this to work, that there is not a way that there can be a balance. There is, it just takes hard work, I think, and conversation and an effort to be put in there to help find these solutions and better engage and better understand one another.
Well, thank you, Kriston. That was, your images are just amazing. And I think they really speak to this topic that we are talking about tonight. So do you know when you've taken like a really good picture, like, like if somebody says, oh, there's a protest going on right now, you run out with your camera. Is there a moment where you just think, this is it? This is the picture that's going to get me the, that's really going to touch people?
Yeah, and so I should note too, I don't do an abundance of protest images, so it's not like I'm always like sitting here like waiting for a phone call, or I'm not always listening to like the police scanner or waiting for something to happen. I do have a scanner app on my phone, so like I do get notifications. But I think at times you do, as a photographer. It's interesting because the goal isn't to just be there and react. It's to put yourself in a position to be able to make that photo, to be aware of what's going on around you, to see what's happening, and to be prepared for that. I think a lot of people see photographers with like really, really great photo equipment, and they think, because and I know there are a couple other photographers here too. Like, how many times have you heard like, "Oh wow, what a nice camera"? It's like, that's great. It doesn't do all the work for me.
Right.
It's about being able to see the moment as it's about to happen. And I think when you make a really, really great photo, it's not just unfolding in front of you, but you're there working actively to help make that happen.
So you sort of, as Sarah says, have to anticipate that something is happening.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So do we have any other questions? I have I have a bunch, but I think I'll let other people choose, decide, because did you all, well, I'll just ask you, did you always know you wanted to be a photographer?
No, not at all. No, I kind of not quite fell into it, but I gradually drifted toward it. I started out in college. I studied journalism and political science, and within journalism, my primary focus was on writing. With the idea, I really loved the idea of like politics and studying national and international issues, and so I wanted to write about those issues. But through a series of events, I ended up working as a designer at the student newspaper. And then I always think this is funny. But as a designer at a student newspaper, you're always looking for images to put in, and then and I see that another professor from Temple is there right now, and so she probably understands that college students don't always want to take on assignments that they think aren't fun or aren't cool, right? And to a degree, I think we see this concept in news in general, right? The idea of like the sexy story that sounds really cool, when there are really a number of smaller stories that are important as well that need to be told. But I ended up just photographing for the paper more and more just to fill in space, and gradually fell more and more in love with the medium of using still images.
And when did you kind of connect the dots that using photography could really make an impact on these kind of causes that seem to be so close to your heart?
That's so actually there is something that really stood out to me. When I was an intern at the Philadelphia Daily News, which now rolled into the Philadelphia Inquirer a long time ago, there's a story of a 2-year-old child in the city of Chester, which is just outside of Philadelphia. And this 2-year-old had been shot and killed. The parents had come home one night, and somebody started firing at them, and they ran into the house and closed the door. And 2 rounds, I think, had been fired through the door, and one of them struck their child in the head, and he died. And so the city ended up having a curfew. It was a very big thing at the time. And it was a tremendous amount of loss. And then in covering that story for a few days, I had revisited with another intern to the site where the shooting had taken place. And I had noticed that there had been a printout of one of the stories that had been run with one of my photos of the grandmother of this child, who was absolutely grieving. And it was printed out and then shown like, do you know anything about this? Offering a reward. And so it was interesting to me because I think as a journalist, I don't always see the direct impact that my work might have on me, especially for something like this. Because a lot of times when we report on violence, it's kind of over and done with, and then we move on because it happens more frequently than it should. But seeing that it took work that I had done and had reframed it in a way for me that I hadn't expected and hadn't anticipated. And so it didn't come across to me as something that was necessarily positive. That's not the way I want to see my work. Nobody wants to see, I think, feel like their images are used like that. But if for that family, it helped illustrate the pain that they were feeling, it helped illustrate for them their loss and helped communicate that, then yeah, that really stood out to me. And that's, something that I would absolutely be willing to do, in my career.
So Grace did say she concurs with your comment about being a college student, choosing your projects. So I would just like to say thank you for this. Your images are amazing. And so, I want to keep using the word impactful. I can't think of anything else that really, strikes me as well as such a good word, but they really touch people. And I appreciate you taking the time to explain the stories behind them, because I think that makes such a better connection for us on what we're looking at and why you took that picture. So
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mina. I really appreciate it. And if anybody does have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. I think my social media is posted somewhere, but it's at KJ Bethel. But I'm not too hard to find online. But if you have any questions, you just want to talk or share anything else, please feel free to reach out.
I'll send out the video link in the recap. You'll all receive it, and I can send out your social media handle as well if people want to connect with you.
Great. All right. Well, thank you so much again, Mina, for the opportunity to speak with everyone.
Absolutely. Thank you, everybody, for being here and for your wonderful questions. Have a great night.
Take care.
Thank you for your time and energy. Bye.
Yep.
Thank you.